another review, and this time we're talking about Man Extremis. Now, before Iron Man 3 came out, a lot of people pronounced this Extremis in interviews, and then within Iron Man 3 and after Iron Man 3, a lot of people pronounced this Extremis. Now, there is no right way to pronounce it. I've heard Warren Ellis call it Extremis, but then I've also heard him in other places call it Extremis. So I don't really think it matters, but I'm going to call it Extremis all the way through this, just because that's how I pronounced it when I first read it, and it hasn't gone away since Iron Man 3. So I'm just going to call it Extremis. Now, Iron Man Extremis is the start of Iron Man Volume 4. Iron Man Volume 4, the first 6 issues of this is Extremis, and if you remember from the previous reviews I did of Iron Man, ever since the end of Len Kaminski's run, it's been very difficult to kind of narrow down where Tony Stark should go from here. The run immediately following Kaminski's run, the run that starts with issue 319, the one that starts with 319, that issue is nothing but a massive recap of everything Tony's been through up to this point, and everything he's learned, all of his mistakes, who he is as a person, just kind of one big comic book issue clip show. And at the end of that, he gets new armor and it starts a new run, and it's supposed to be like a new chapter in his life. But I think I mentioned before with Iron Man 318 that if you wanted to end the character there, you could have. Everything that was being done from the beginnings of his Tales of Suspense stuff, from Tales of Suspense 139 up to Iron Man Volume 1 318, all of that is basically one story. There's regression thrown in the middle of that. I don't think the second McLean-Layton run is very good. I think it hurts the character a bit. There were elements of the John Byrne run that work better than others. There are elements before Bill Montello got onto the book that don't work sometimes and then work other times. So it's not perfect, but it is a progression. It's a very clear progression. And after that, it's very difficult to find an occasion for story with Tony Stark, because what more do you want to say with him at that point? The kind of character that was created by Stan Lee back in the day evolved to a point, especially when you get to the Michelangelo-Layton stuff, and became sort of a definitive person at that point, that after that, it was Tony's personality governing the types of stories being told, not the writers determining the types of stories that need to be told in order to keep the character going forward. And after 318, after that issue ended, Iron Man kind of became about that. Iron Man kind of became about figuring out what stories we haven't done yet that might match this character. And you need to do that from time to time. There was a big kind of growing pain period for Daredevil after Miller got on the book, where everyone kind of figured out who Daredevil was now that Frank Miller had kind of hammered it into people. But there were still issues here and there of like, okay, if this is who he is, then would this story match him? Would that story match him? And then eventually you get into like a more steady series of good Daredevil, particularly when Bendis takes over. But even before that, with stuff by like Kevin Smith. So Iron Man, all through Volume 3 became this, and all through Volume 2 became this as well, where we ended Volume 1 with a run that was kind of unsure of itself, was kind of unsure of Tony Stark, and then we get into the Volume 2 stuff, which is all of the Heroes Reborn stuff. Volume 1 ended with the whole young Tony thing, which was just dumb and nonsensical. Heroes Reborn is dumb and nonsensical, and it's written by Scott Lobdell, so there's that. And then Volume 3 opens with Kurt Busiek, and he kind of gives us the best new entry in Iron Man's movement forward that we've gotten so far. And Busiek definitely had a direction going, but he ended too quickly. And then everything from Busiek with Quesada and Frank Thierry and John J. Miller and Mike Grell and Mike Ricketts and Robin Laws, all of these guys started doing runs on Iron Man that were attempting to figure out where he needed to go next. Every run would end with an issue saying, next week, next month, we'll come back and tell the new, definitive, bold new direction for Iron Man. And every time, it didn't last very long. And so, Iron Man as a character was meandering. We limped through the 90s of comics with a lot of major stunts, but then Iron Man it was very difficult for Iron Man to get back his footing after 2000, and we tried to make him like the post-war commentary guy, and some of that stuck, and some of those elements didn't stick, so it became a very difficult period. And so it was Warren Ellis's job with Iron Man Volume 4 to craft a new character, saying, basically, do what you want with this character, but give us a way, give us somewhere to run, give us a new outline to work from. And arguably that's what he did, kind of. Because Extremis is one of the most influential and important Iron Man stories, and one of the most pointless and skippable Iron Man stories at the same time. And I'll get into more of that. I'll talk about some of that towards the end of this, but when I go to some of the later stuff, particularly when I start talking about like the Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff, it'll very quickly become clear that Warren Ellis' only contribution to Iron Man that had any sort of staying power was the idea of Extremis. So we'll go ahead and get into some of this. Iron Man Extremis brings in the Extremis armor, and the Extremis armor is the most iconic Iron Man armor, second only to the classic red and gold armor. The Extremis armor is the basis for the Iron Man film armors, and the film armors change a few things here and there aesthetically, and they have the new faceplate, which they haven't changed. Every armor you see Tony wear as his main armor throughout the films have basically the same faceplate design. And aside from that, most of the way the original Mark III armor and stuff was laid out is very similar to Extremis, and Extremis itself is almost completely identical to the Iron Secretary armor, which is almost, with the exception of like two lines that come down here, almost identical to the Tin Man armor from the Mike Grell stuff. So from Mike Grell's Iron Man Volume 3, number 50, all the way through to the end of Iron Man Volume 4 with issue, I want to say 31, 32, Iron Man's basically wearing, well, even more than that, all the way up to Invincible Iron Man when you get to World's Most Wanted. It's basically the same armor. And that is somewhat of an oversimplification, because the Iron Secretary armor is a little bit different. Just a little bit different than what Mike Grell had. Mike Grell's armor, the Tin Man armor, kept changing the faceplate here and there. It was a little bit more bulky. And then when you get to the armor that you open Extremis with, it is very much that previous Iron Secretary armor, but just a little bit smoothed out. And then when you get to the end of this book, the final Extremis armor is that same design, the same sort of smoothing effect, but also a little bit more slim. And so, for the most part, it is the same aesthetic. And I think that's important to mention, because as I've gone through all of these Iron Man reviews, I've mentioned a lot of armor changes, different armors, armor upgrades, good armors, bad armors. Armor is kind of the core of Iron Man aesthetically. So armors become very, very important. And I mentioned in the Joe Quesada stuff where there's a scene where Tony is fighting the sentient safe armor, and when he's fighting it, he puts on the old modular armor. Now, the modular armor came out in Iron Man number 300, which was just in the 90s. And so the 90s to 2000, if you read that scene in context, I mentioned this, where it feels like there's been an eternity between the safe armor and the modular armor. Yet there hasn't. There's just been so many armors that happen in between. And after you get rid of Extremis, Bleeding Edge is only there for like a year, and then you come back to do the Karen Gillan stuff, which has got like the Repulsor Tech armor, which then gets dumped for the Space armor, and then comes back a little bit towards the end of that run, and then you get the Superior Iron Man Endosim armor, and then that gets ditched for the armor that Brian Michael Bendis is using. Armors, even before that, like the Young Tony armor was barely around, the Heroes Reborn Scott Lobdell armor was barely around, Renaissance armor, I don't even think that thing made it past a year. Safe armor lasted a little bit longer, but then also had immediate consequences. Ren became a bad guy pretty quickly, and then some of the other stuff, like the modular armor, didn't last very long. There's just this massive history of Iron Man armors that don't stick around anymore. The longest running armor we really had was the classic red and gold. And then Silver Centurion came in, and it didn't have the longest run. It's actually pretty short for how long that armor's there, even though it's considered quite iconic. And it is one of my favorites. I love the Silver Centurion armor. But it wasn't around for too long before we got oversized red and gold. And then oversized red and gold kept getting modified, because Tony was paralyzed, to being different versions of the telepresence armor. And so armor stability has gotten nuts. And so Extremis, the design of that armor, the fact that that armor has been there for the most part visually all the way through Mike Grell's run up to World's Most Wanted of Matt Fraction's run, is important. And the fact that it is part of the movie canon with the way the Mark III armor is based very much on it, that's important. Because it's the most consistent Iron Man's armor has been for a very long time. In the span of 24 years, from the modular armor to 2016, 9 of those years have been dominated by an armor that looks like this. And they're not all the same model, but for the most part, it is this aesthetic. And that's the longest run an armor has had for a very long time. Like, classic red and gold is really the only other armor that's been around for that much time. And that sort of historical importance shouldn't be understated, because it gives you a sense of why Iron Man armor seems to always come up when people review Iron Man comics. For people that don't read Iron Man, the concept of going on a tangent about armor seems really boring and ridiculous. We know this. Captain Logan doesn't really like armor rants, but it's important because the armor is so important to Tony as a character and to his personality. The fact that he gets addicted to it, the stuff that he does later, the fact that it's a symbol for lots of things like the military-industrial complex, and it's an outlet for addiction, but then it's also a symbol for Iron Man as post-traumatic stress and all of that. So armor is really important, and the fact that Extremis is as iconic as it is the story is as iconic as it is. Most of the reason that's there is because of the armor. It's because it kind of represents the pinnacle of what that armor aesthetic is, and its consequences all throughout Iron Man history. And so that's the armors. And something that kind of bugs me, but I can understand more because it's so iconic, is that the end of this trade, it has a bunch of Iron Man comic covers, and he shows off this armor to show off, and to make you think, oh, look how cool Extremis is. Except this isn't Extremis. This is the Iron Secretary armor. This is all from Iron Man Volume 3. And I don't understand why they reprint Iron Man Volume 3 covers in the back of the Extremis trade, because this isn't the Extremis armor. This is before that. And that's just a weird thing with Iron Man Extremis armor stuff, which is a lot of people think of iconic Extremis covers that really belong to the John J. Miller Iron Secretary stuff. But again, it's part of that legacy thing. It's part of the fact that the armor design stuck around for as long as it did. So that's the armor rant. Now we can go in and talk about the actual story here. Now, this is written by Warren Ellis. And Warren Ellis, in his own words, doesn't like superheroes. Now, it's a bit of an exaggeration on his part, because there are a lot of superheroes he does enjoy. And he gets lots of cool inspiration from certain superheroes. But Warren Ellis, as a writer, is not a superhero guy. And he's made this clear several times. He talks about how comics he does, like Moon Knight and like Iron Man here, and then his other stuff that involves superhero characters, a lot of what he wants to do is deconstruct the notion of a superhero in order to tell his own stories, and then you go off and read his own stories, and they're very different. So Warren Ellis automatically has a different approach to this, which is partly why him being the guy to remodel Tony Stark as a character makes some amount of sense, is that he's not going to approach it from the traditional superhero comic way. And so it gives you a different sort of unique starting point. Now, Warren Ellis may not like superheroes, but in many cases he understands how to build them and how to deconstruct them and what makes them tick. He's very good at character psychology. And Warren Ellis has said that he didn't read any Iron Man. He said that he doesn't know anything about the character, and all he did is go back to like the very early like Stan Lee stuff. And so There's some references here and there to like Michelini Layton, but for the most part, he doesn't know Iron Man. And so what he's doing here is very much meant to be in its own canon. It's meant to be, and I mean, it is in canon, it is a continuation of the stuff that happens in Volume 3, but for the most part, it tries to be as independent as possible. And so there are references to Captain America, there are references to the Avengers, there are references to things like Fing Fang Foom, but none of that really factors into the greater piece here. The fact that this character exists in the greater Marvel universe is not important to this particular story. So it feels different right away, and that's partly why I say that this is a story that's extremely important and influential, and also completely skippable with no real consequences, because it's written in a vacuum, yet there are minor things from this story that get sprinkled and picked up on all the way through Iron Man's history, or at least modern history with this. This is the big retelling Iron Man. This is our brand new Tony Stark version of Iron Man. What Warren Ellis does, for the most part here, in these 6 issues, is he makes Tony Stark into a futurist, a more definitive futurist, which is an element of his character that's always been there, but it's always played second fiddle to his sort of guilt, his need to kind of help everyone all the time. And what Warren Ellis does is that he kind of consolidates all of these little broken fragments of Tony's psychology and turns them all into one central goal that explains everything he would go through, which is Tony Stark is a futurist. Tony Stark is the kind of person that needs to constantly be building towards something. That his need to help people, his business ventures, his armor technology, all of this is in some way to shape a vision he has for the future. And so, even when it comes to like ideas of like loss of life and killing people, a lot of his guilt and his morality is built around this notion of robbing someone's future. And it becomes more central to him, it becomes more verbalized here than it's ever really been. Extremis is, in a lot of ways, a book that's trying to set up a personality before it's telling a story, because that's the weakest link here, is that it's a 6-issue comic where there's lots of interesting things being done with Tony as a character, but the story itself is really, really weak. Very little happens here. It's only 6 issues, and it reads like it's 2. If you want to sit down and read Extremis cover to cover, I promise you it will not take more than 45 minutes. At that. I mean, if you don't stop to look at the art and just kind of like appreciate some of the action sequences, if you don't do that, if you're just going from word balloon to word balloon, it will take you 45 minutes tops. It is a really short comic. It's a very quick read. There are lots of extended action sequences with no dialogue. It's an extremely quick read, and this conflict, this fight, a lot of it is manufactured just so we can talk about some very minor elements of Tony's character that become important going forward. And so let me go ahead and mention some of the brief connections here to Iron Man Legacy again, and then more about the character stuff. Back in the old days of Iron Man comics, he had a secretary named Mrs. Abergost, and they had kind of like a banter relationship. They were always kind of like trading quips and such, but for the most part, they had a genuine respect for each other, and Tony really appreciated her presence. And Tony has a secretary here, but he's just kind of a smart aleck to her, and it's trying to be like a more modern, updated version of the witty banter he used to have with Mrs. Abergost, but it's a different secretary, and it just feels kind of awkward, but it's again, a bit of a reference to that stuff. And that's cool, that's fine. The really interesting thing, though, is Tony's dialogue with her, and then Tony's action throughout this book, all reflect who Tony is as a person, and how every element of this book, every bit of dialogue we have in this book is in some way trying to reflect an element of Tony Stark. And so there's a scene in this book where Tony looks at the mirror, and he just woke up and he's staring at himself in the mirror, and he says, "What are you looking at?" And it's very reminiscent of a scene in the Michelini and Layton stuff in, I want to say, the final set of issues of their first run, where, and in that run there's the really interesting idea of Tony thinking of Iron Man as an external entity, thinking of Iron Man as a different person. And so there's this beautiful scene in the Michelini-Layton stuff where he's in the armor, he's got the helmet off, he's holding it out like Hamlet with Yorick's skull, and he's talking to it, and he's blaming it for what's happened. And it's a very interesting notion of Iron Man or Tony having a conversation with himself and being in a lot of ways not able to live with himself as a whole person. And a lot of that's personified here with Tony's entire complex. Tony's whole personality, his morality, his needs are all distilled down into this idea of being the futurist. And his need, his kind of problem with himself as a person, his guilt and such, is manifested and symbolized in the form of Tony not being able to look at himself in the eyes. That Tony is terrified of his own reflection, which is really, really interesting. And there was this scene in the opening of the book where he's talking to a documentary filmmaker, and the documentary filmmaker is making this documentary about called The Ghosts of the 21st Century, or the 20th Century. And it's all about like weapons designers and kind of the state of the world as a consequence of 20th century imperialism and militarism. And so he talks to Tony, and he paints him into a corner, and he runs through kind of what happened to Tony about Stark landmines being the thing that causes Tony to get shrapnel put into his chest. So it is like the third or fourth revamping of that origin. And he really harps on this fact that Tony, despite being about the future, has this inability to acknowledge the consequences of his actions, or this inability to emotionally handle or be ready for fallout. There will be a scene later in the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff where he treats being director of S.H.I.E.L.D. like a business, and so there are lots of moments here where he's kind of trying to protect everyone. He's not seeing the people under his command as soldiers. He's seeing them as liabilities that he needs to protect, and so he's incapable of really letting them go and be putting themselves in harm's way. And that's kind of what Tony has here, but with himself, where he's unable to be emotionally prepared and to have like a real, honest conversation about the consequences of his actions. And that's part of his guilt. That's part of his need to constantly see forward and into the future, but never feeling safe with it. Always knowing that it's in flux and being terrified or sad about it. Which is really interesting. And so the documentary filmmaker talks a lot about Tony's weapons, and Tony keeps trying to fire back saying that, well, I wanted to do this, but the only way for me to get the money to do this was to use a piece of it for this military application. And it is kind of like rationalization, and Tony doesn't feel right about it, but at the same time, he's trying to justify his actions, and ultimately it comes down as Tony being afraid of the world, being afraid of the way the world has kind of shaped and transformed, and how he's not in control of it. Now, at the end of the documentary segment, the documentary guy is saying that, you know my body of work, you know everything I've talked about, you know the kinds of questions I ask. Why did you agree to do this interview? Why did you agree to make you look bad? And Tony says that, well, you've done all these documentaries, but you haven't changed anything. None of your issues have been resolved, and have you even kept up with half of the things you claim to want to change? And the documentary filmmaker just says, I don't know, and he leaves. And that taps into more of Tony's psychology of he's terrified of the future not living up to his vision for it. And his problem with people, for the most part, is their inability to see 5 steps ahead the way he does. And so there's this really interesting psychological middle ground between other people and Tony Stark that builds this superiority complex that leads Tony into a bigger inferiority complex, which is really interesting. And it is, in a lot of ways, trying to build on the psychology of Tony that we've gotten in past comics. But again, more verbalizing of it. There's lots of conversations in this book that are just talking to the audience, saying that this is our psychoanalysis of who Tony Stark is. And that's one of the biggest problems here, is the story doesn't work. The plot doesn't make any sense, and it's one of the most bare-bones, emotionless stories I've ever read. But then there are moments like this with the documentary filmmaker, and then when you get to Maya Hansen and Sal Kennedy and they're talking to Tony, and you get these moments, this break from the story, from the plot itself, to just have the characters sit there and talk about who Tony is, what he wants to be, what his future is, and that kind of thing. And from that perspective, it's really interesting. And from that perspective, it's what's going forward. It's that element of Tony, of this book, that's going forward. It's the element of Tony's psychology being verbalized as a futurist and kind of an isolated personality. Because of that, it's Sal Kennedy and Maya Hansen being part of that, and what Extremis is as a plot point going forward. That's all the stuff from this book that gets carried forward into the rest of Iron Man's history. The stuff with Malin, the whole twist ending with Maya Hansen, its need to exist in kind of an outside of continuity style of being written, none of that really works for it. And in all honesty, if you don't want to read Extremis, or you don't have the trade for Extremis, you could just go and pick up Iron Man Execute. You could just go and pick up Iron Man Execute Program, which is the second volume, or the second collection of Iron Man Volume 4 stuff, and just go from there. Just all you really need to know is what Extremis is as a technological concept. Because a lot of Tony's psychological stuff is handled far more naturally in the run going forward than it is in this particular run. And that's, again, the ultimate problem here, is that a lot of what's happening doesn't gel with the past because Warren Ellis is not familiar with that. Warren Ellis doesn't know about the Secretary of Defense stuff. Warren Ellis doesn't care about it, really, and he's just writing his own story. And so he's got lines here where Tony says, I don't understand how I ever got this to fit into a case. And he's putting on the same armor that just one issue ago did fit inside of a case. And the previous armor had that ability of just like being able to fly and snap onto him. And it did just get rolled into a case. And here he's got basically the same armor, but he's unable to do that. And so he just transports it in like a big crate that he takes wherever he needs the Iron Man armor. And that, again, doesn't gel with the past stuff, but it also doesn't gel with the stuff going forward, because Iron Man's getting able to do that kind of thing. And then the run going forward makes lots of references to Iron Man as Secretary of Defense, to Iron Man with Avengers Disassembled, and all that stuff. And this book doesn't make reference to any of that. And so it exists in this void, this kind of area of gray continuity, where a lot of what it's using as context to redefine Tony has completely gone away and doesn't last past this run. But some of the specific stuff of Tony's side characters and the Extremis technology is what goes forward. Sal Kennedy and Maya Hansen are kind of the biggest problems with this, really, because it feels more retroactive. Sal Kennedy was a teacher of Tony's back in the day, and Maya Hansen was a woman he met at a conference back in the day, and all three of them had formed like this strong bond. And it's kind of a replacement for Pepper Potts and Happy Hogan, who Happy Hogan's died, Pepper has gone away. And so they're like the new supporting cast for his book going forward after this. And it's like the Batman Hush thing, where you're telling me now that these people have always known each other, but they didn't exist before. And so I have to like retroactively imagine that they were there. And so going forward, when all of the future runs of Iron Man post-Extremis make reference to things before Extremis, their inclusion is really awkward, because their inclusion is designed as a new beginning. And so, again, it's just very awkward the way continuity for this whole thing gels. And it's kind of interesting in places to see these characters develop and have their relationships, but it's also kind of... It takes you out of the books, the Iron Man comic going forward every now and then, when you see things like Tony going to Sal Kennedy for advice as like a father figure, when we've known he's never done that before. And in a lot of ways, it feels like it exists in this void, picking and choosing continuity, and then everything else does like the Grant Morrison Hypertime thing of like, we're going to pick and choose what parts of this book matter going forward. And I think that's ultimately why it's so... the armor aside, I think that's ultimately why the book is so influential going forward, is everyone on Iron Man saw a couple of things in Extremis that they wanted to use going forward, even though they didn't want to use the whole book. And so when you get like a room of 5 writers together that all pulled a little bit from Extremis, eventually they've all pulled from the entire book. And so it's kind of like just defaultly important, as opposed to being genuinely a massive groundbreaking story of the character going forward. Because again, a lot of this interesting psychological stuff, it's been there already. It's always been part of Iron Man and Tony Stark. It's just being verbalized here. And while that makes for interesting discussion, it makes for a bad story, because the dialogue gets so heavy-handed in places, and the story just stops to have like these existential psychoanalysis conversations. And there's even a point here where like Tony is beating the crap out of Malin, and Malin is Tony just sits there and says, "You represent my nightmares. You represent the guy that can't see the future." And again, it's this weird one-sided conversation where Tony is talking to the reader. Malin has no clue what he really means. And so Malin is just trying to defend for his life and beat the crap out of Iron Man. And Tony's there like speechifying for our sake. And that's, again, part of the problem. Malin's got some interesting things here and there. He grew up in like a very, very stereotypically Southern family. Like he's got very hard-lined right views. He's very extreme in places, and Extremis is the thing that brings that out of him and gives him the means to help stop the people he disagrees with, and like, as he says it, like, take back his idea of America. And some of that's interesting because it is a good contrast to what Tony's trying to do. Malin's trying to recapture the past, Tony's trying to shape the future. But Malin doesn't know that about Tony. And Tony doesn't really know that about Malin. There's a line where he's like, where he makes reference to Malin's history, but there's no way he can really know about Malin. He just kind of does it for our sake. And so both of these characters have interesting psychologies that we as readers can connect as they're fighting. But the fact that Tony has to sit there and speechify it for us is the biggest problem with that. Now, let's go ahead and talk about what Extremis is. Extremis is this formula, this enhancer created by Maya Hansen, that plugs into the brain. It's like the movie. It's like Iron Man 3, where Aldrich Killian is saying that like the human body is destined to be upgraded. It's designed to be upgraded. What Extremis is this formula that's attempting to be a super soldier serum, and when you inject it into the human subject, it goes to the repair center of the brain and gives it like a new schematic for what the human body is, and then the entire human body is reshaped and re-regulated to match the enhanced blueprints of Extremis. And then from there, you get like super strength and fire breath and all of that stuff, and you become a super soldier. But the success to failure rate is, the casualty rate of anyone taking Extremis is like 97%. And so very few people survive it except for Malin. And then when you get to the later stuff like Iron Man Haunted, there's discussion of like a specific gene in people that allows them to be resistant to the more deadly side effects of Extremis. And so Iron Man initially gets the crap kicked out of him by Malin because his technology doesn't react as quickly as his brain thinks. And so when he gets the crap kicked out of him, he goes to Maya Hansen, and they together rework what Extremis is in order for it to be a connective between technology and Tony. And so now all he has to do is think something, and technology reacts. He can see through satellites. He can control the armor remotely just from his mind. He can multitask in the sense that like he can generate a projection of himself to talk to people on one end while remote controlling the armor to attack someone on some other end while doing some kind of like computer breakdown system update at the same time in his own office. And so it's all about what Tony's mind is capable of is now the limit of a technology. And so he becomes this hybrid, this biotechnological being. And it's a very interesting contrast to what Captain America's type of super soldier serum is. Particularly when those two clash going forward, because this is getting closer and closer to what eventually Civil War would be. And so that's interesting. And I like a lot of where a lot of that's going. And then the bigger problem, though, is for a lot of people, is that Extremis is too close to giving Iron Man superpowers. And I don't want to talk too much about that, because that's going to factor into the later set of issues when we talk about Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and stuff. But I don't necessarily have that problem. I don't have the problem of Extremis gives Iron Man superpowers, because all it really is it's completely biological, technology based. Like, it's completely artificial and it's completely intent driven. There wasn't some magic lab accident that made Tony Stark this way. It is this conscious technological enhancement that he knows about going forward, and it can be infected and broken down, which is what happens with World's Most Wanted. So I think that's all good and natural. The problem is that it's too powerful. The problem is, when you get to stuff like Execute Program, Tony is able to do things that are just way too far. Like, he's just way too strong in places. Seeing through satellites is just one step too far for me when it comes to Iron Man. I think at that point, with what Extremis does to him and the way he's able to just react based on a thought, I think it makes him too deadly. It makes him too godly. And the later stuff like addresses the reclusive side effects of Extremis, but at that point, Tony can take out the Sentry. There's no superhero around that should be able to take out Tony Stark, and that just feeds into more of the armor problems of, if Iron Man's constantly upgrading, then his rogues gallery should at some point be so far behind him technologically that they aren't threats anymore, and yet that never happens. They always seem to get upgraded proportionally to Iron Man, so the fights are always even. And by the time Tony gets Extremis, that shouldn't happen anymore. Like, Tony should not need a modified Hulkbuster to take out the Hulk after he's got Extremis. And that's the problem, is that, like, that's just a step too far. It's not a superpower thing, it's just you've made him too strong. You've made him unbeatable. And there are some interesting things that's done with that later, but Extremis as a concept, that's just more my problem with it. I would recommend reading this only because it will take you like 4 minutes, so you're not really losing anything. I think this is a good place to start with Iron Man. As an introduction to this character, I think it's good, because if you read this and then retroactively go back to like the Michelini and Layton stuff, you'll understand the subtleties and the nuances of that a lot more. I think this as a character study for Tony Stark is really interesting. I think as a story, and just particularly the way it's structured and written, I think it's very poor. There's so much of just talking to the audience, writer, character analyzing, self-indulgence in this, that it's not a particularly good narrative. And then there's also just the added side effect of how this is meant to be outside of a canon and establishing a new one, and then later canon picking and choosing what parts of it work and what don't. So it makes for a very awkward progression for Iron Man. The art is good. I like the art. I can understand the complaint of it's too computery, it's too stilted, it looks too much like frames, which is fair, but I like it because it feels so dynamic. This was turned into a motion comic, and I think it's perfect for that kind of thing. I feel like it's really good, particularly because of the pace. I feel like it's good art for like how quickly it moves and how dynamic it has to be and how almost melodramatic it is in the dialogue of these. This isn't how real people speak. This is how a heightened universe speaks. And so for that, I think the art is good. I would recommend checking it out. I do think it's interesting. I wouldn't say it's... I guess I did say it, but okay. Let me try and make this my definitive statement on it. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's well written. I don't think it's a good story. But I think as far as being an Iron Man fan or creating an Iron Man fan or as an introduction to Iron Man, it's really interesting. And it's so interesting in places, particularly if you don't know Iron Man, that the narrative cheats and problems and lack of characterization for everyone else won't necessarily bother you. So, if I made a list of top 10 Iron Man stories, it wouldn't be on there. But I think it's worth checking out, particularly for people that don't read Iron Man. That's basically all I have here. This is interesting, and that's really the best way I can describe it. It's constantly in print. You should be able to find a copy of it pretty easily. Let me know what you think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said. I'll be back with you next time, particularly with more Iron Man reviews, to talk about the rest of Volume 4, which starts up with Execute Program. But until then, let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.